I've made no secrets about how impressed I've been with the new Sony A7 III, and I am considering switching from Canon over to it, just for what you get in terms of performance for the price. And Curious Life has asked, can I do a comparison between the Sony A7 III and the Canon 1DX Mark II to try and explain where the extra $3.5 grand price tag comes in on the Canon over the Sony? Well, on paper, the price tag makes no sense. You have a 24 megapixel sensor versus a 20 megapixel. You have 10 frames a second versus 12 frames a second. You have 693 phase detection points versus 61 autofocus points. You have 4K video versus 4K video. You have 120 1080 versus 120 1080. And you have a £2,000 price tag versus selling a kidney. So to most people watching, you're probably thinking, the differences in specs don't justify the differences in price. But that's because these only tell half the story. On paper, Sony's A9 flagship camera doesn't look that dissimilar to the Sony A7 III, but the A9 is priced closer to the 1DX Mark II. Now, the differences between the Sony A9 to the Sony A7 III, you have to delve in a little bit more to fully understand them. Firstly, they share similar resolution sensors, but they aren't the same sensors. Also, the A9 has more processing power than the A7 III, so while in a mechanical shutter mode they both shoot at 10 frames a second, the A9 is able to remove the information off the sensor much faster. So in an electronic shutter mode, the A9 can shoot at 20 frames a second versus 10 frames a second of the A7 III. Also, because it can pull the information off the sensor quicker, it doesn't suffer with rolling shutter quite as much as the A7 III does. So if you're planning on shooting anything kind of fast moving with an electronic shutter or video of fast moving subjects, you're not going to get as much rolling shutter with the A9 as you do with the A7 III. Then you have things like the EVF in the A9 is a better quality one to the A7 III. Now, to most people, they probably wouldn't really notice the difference between these unless they did them in a side-by-side comparison. But again, it's just another element that you might want to consider. So basically, for most people, the A9 isn't really going to be a viable option for you. But if you are after a sports wildlife camera, fast shooting is a priority for you, then that extra price difference to the A9 could well be justified. And this is where we have the same sort of story between the A7 III and the 1DX Mark II. The big differences between these two cameras. Firstly, the 1DX Mark II has a much greater battery life than the A7 III. Now, the A7 III's battery has been improved over previous generations, but is not going to last anywhere close to what the 1DX Mark II can achieve. Then there's the shooting speed. 14 frames a second versus 10 frames might not seem like that much of a difference. 10 frames a second for most people is probably going to be more than enough. But if you are somebody who shoots a lot of sports, a lot of wildlife professionally, and it's crucial that you capture that key moment, sometimes those extra few frames a second can make all the difference between getting or not getting a shot. Then coupled with the shooting speed, you also have to consider the buffer. Now, in the Sony A7 III, the camera is using two SD card slots. One is a UHS 1, one is a UHS 2. Now, the buffer depth of that camera is rated at about 40 RAW files, which means you can get about 4 seconds of continual shooting before the buffer fills up. By comparison, the two card slots in a 1DX Mark II are a CFast 2.0 and a CF card. Now, using a CFast 2.0 card in that camera, you can shoot 14 frames a second continual for about 170 RAW files, which is about 12 seconds of continuous shooting. Now, it's only really sports, wildlife, photojournalists who are going to be needing that sort of buffer depth, but then that is who this camera is aimed at. Then there's the build quality. Now, I'm not saying the A7 III is a badly built camera, but it's built to a budget, so there's going to be some compromises along the way. So it's not going to be as rugged and reliable as a 1DX Mark II. And what I mean by that is, if you drop a Sony A7 III, part of the camera will probably break. If you drop a 1DX Mark II, it will probably dig a hole in the floor. The 1DX Mark II is going to be a lot better in terms of ruggedness and weather sealing. So if you go out and about in conditions that are kind of either rain or a lot of dust, a lot of extreme weather, you're going to be rest assured that if you've got the 1DX Mark II and a kind of well-built lens like a Canon L lens or something like that, then that camera is going to be absolutely fine. Whereas you take something like the Sony A7 III out into extreme conditions and it's probably going to start developing issues. But again, most people considering the A7 III aren't planning on venturing up Everest or going into the Amazon rainforest anytime soon, so probably isn't going to be that much of an issue. Then there's the video. There's a few differences here as well. Now, for example, they both shoot 4K. However, the 4K footage in the A7 III goes up to 30 frames a second versus 60 frames a second in the 1DX Mark II. Then there's the codecs. Sony are using MPEG-4 codec, which is a kind of mainstream, fairly common video codec that most people can use, whereas Canon are using MJPEG for their 4K footage, which is massively unuser-friendly for most people, and the bitrate for it is through the roof, so the file sizes are enormous, but then it means there's a lot more information in the file for if you are wanting to professionally edit that footage. Same with the 1080. Both shoot 1080 at 120 frames a second. However, the Sony's MPEG-4 compresses it down at 100 megabits a second bitrate versus the Canon 1DX Mark II's 120 frames a second is at 380 megabits a second. So the video footage that you would see from the 1DX Mark II is probably going to be better than what you would get from a Sony A7 III. So there are certainly some differences. Now, whether those differences justify the price difference is entirely on your circumstances. If you are somebody who is after the absolute best quality camera that you can get in terms of fastest shooting speed, best build quality, best possible video performance, all in the one camera, then yes, the 1DX Mark II might be the better option for you if you can justify the price tag. But for most people out there, the A7 III would probably be more than sufficient for your needs. So ultimately, it's horses for courses. Which camera suits what you need to do best? There is no right or wrong answer. If there was a perfect camera, everybody would own the same thing. You need to work out what you're looking for from a camera, which aspects of it are most important to you, how much you want to spend, and really, is it going to be worth the investment for you or not? Then have a look and see which camera fits the bill best within the price point. So myself, for example, I do photos, I do video. I don't need the extreme shooting speed, but it can be handy at times. Video is quite important to me. The Sony A7 III fits what I need really well at a price that is really, really affordable. The 1DX Mark II, awesome camera and would love to own it, but at the price that it's going to cost, I can't justify it because I'm not going to see the benefit from it. Somebody else might look at the Sony A7 III and go, that doesn't do what I need it for, but the 1DX Mark II does, and that price I can recoup by the benefits that I'm going to see from it. So ultimately, comes down to you. Hope that's answered your question, curious. Anybody else watching, thank you so much for stopping by. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and make sure to turn on your notifications so that you know when my next video goes live, and hopefully, I'll see you there.